friends, welcome back. I'm Christina, the manager of the Pacific Beach Library. Thank you for joining me for day 16 of our read along together of Wuthering Heights by Emily Brontë. It is the penultimate day of our read along together of Wuthering Heights, which means that there are some special events coming up. We're going to finish our read along tomorrow on Tuesday. On Wednesday, the 26th, we're going to host our screening of the film. And you guys had voted that you would like to watch the 1970 version starring Timothy Dalton, James Bond, but here he'll be Heathcliff. That's going to be available on Wednesday from noon until midnight. And you can watch it anytime during that period. I will be watching it at 3 o'clock if you want to comment along with me. But that's going to be on Wednesday. And I will post again in our... I'll post a thing in our group afterwards, letting you know where, again, you can register on the San Diego Public Library's calendar for the registration information for that. Let's see. Then also on Thursday, we're going to have a tea party where we'll discuss Wuthering Heights, both the book and the film version. So if you would like to join us on Thursday, we'll do our tea party at our usual time of 3 o'clock to discuss Wuthering Heights, all the goodness and the kind of weirdness. And so we can discuss that together on Thursday. Let's see. Are there any other special events coming up? Why, yes, there is. There's one more special event. Since we're wrapping up Wuthering Heights, it means we have an opportunity to choose what we will read next. Right now, in the standings, in the voting on our website, I'm just scrolling along on my computer to see, there are 3 books that are kind of neck and neck for what we'll read next. I'm going to give you a little peek at them so you can get a feel for in case this influences where you want to vote. One possibility is Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. We have already read 2 other Jane Austen novels. They've been lovely. If you would like to read a third, Sense and Sensibility is what we are voting on this time. Another possibility, also tied with 3 votes, is Middlemarch by George Eliot. I have not read this one myself. It has been on my list for a long, long time, so this would be a fun one to read together. And finally, trailing slightly with 2 votes, but which is also really close to catch up, would be Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray. So, if you would like to read any of these books, or any, also on the list right now is Little Women and Moby Dick. It's not too late to add something else though, because only a couple votes separating each of them. But these are the possibility, these are the front runners right now. Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen, Middlemarch by George Eliot, and Vanity Fair by William Thackeray. And so if you would like to pick any of these, in case it's an influence also, I will let you know. Some books are a little longer than others. So if you want a shorter read, Sense and Sensibility, it looks like Vanity Fair is a longer book, but not quite as long as Middlemarch. So if the length of the book matters to you, then keep that in mind as well. All right, so please go ahead and cast your votes. At 3 o'clock tomorrow, at the start of our final day of reading of Wuthering Heights, we'll announce the winner. And if there is a tie, we'll go ahead and do a drawing between the top options to decide. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and pour my tea so that I will have something refreshing to drink while we are discussing what we read last Thursday. A whole weekend has gone by. And for those of you who remember, I was posting also that there was like this wonderful how-to festival event that we did on Saturday for the library. I am exhausted still. And so because of that, let's find out and refresh our memories, because maybe you, like me, do not remember very clearly what happened last Thursday. The tea that I'm drinking today is called Earl Grey La Creme, and I keep wanting to say Earl Grey de la Creme. I forgot to bring a spoon with me, so I have my cream all sinking to the bottom. Oh no. Oh no. All right, well, that'll be what it is. I'll try to give it a swirl, but I'm worried about like spilling hot tea all over my office. So this Earl Grey La Creme is one of the teas that I picked up at Point Loma Tea when I was picking up the teas for our Monte Cristo tea party. By the way, thank you for everyone who came to that. And if you were not able to come and you wish you could do it next year, we have penciled it onto our calendars. Feel free to do the same for yourselves. Next year, all hoping that we should be able to do it in person. So next year, May 21st, 10:30 a.m., be there for Count of Monte Cristo tea. In person, let's hope. And I see that Judy is drinking their French breakfast tea from the tea party. It's a nice tea, isn't it? It has a really good flavor. All right, but this one is another one that I picked up that day. It's the Earl Grey La Creme. And it says it's just 100% black tea with pure essential oil of bergamot and lavender. So a basic Earl Grey with some extra lavender. Oh, it did kind of distribute itself even without the spoon. Ooh, that's delightful. That's really, really good. I do love a nice Earl Grey. And yes, Adrienne commented that the How To Festival might need a little longer than a day to decompress. I agree. It's a wonderful, wonderful event. And in fact, I'm just going to throw out my pitch for it now. There are 50 videos available for you to watch. Adrienne, if you're still here, go ahead and post the website, please. If not, I'll post it afterwards. It's sandiego.gov/H2F for the How To Festival. And you can watch those videos. You can, there's 50 of them available to learn from. There's a lot of good things. I do recommend it. It's a lot of fun, but as one of the planners, it was also very, very tiring when it was done. It was just really a relief that it all went well. And so, speaking of things that are momentous and huge and they're very emotional, that brings us right back to Wuthering Heights. Let's talk about what we read on Thursday. Thank you, Adrienne, for posting that website. Let's see. So chapter 28, we read 3 chapters on Thursday. They were short. Chapter 28 was basically, okay, I see. We had resumed with Nellie Dean talking about how she was locked away in Wuthering Heights with Catherine Linton, who at that point we find out has now become Catherine Linton Heathcliff. The names all over again. So Cathy, young Cathy, has now wed young Linton Heathcliff. And we discovered that there was talk in the town that maybe Nellie Dean and young Cathy Linton, had gotten lost in the marshes and been like either stranded or even dead out there, but no, they were quite well. And in fact, now we learned that Cathy did indeed go through with her word and she married Linton Heathcliff. Sorry, I'm just gonna pause to say Adrienne Peterson is super nice, thank you. Let's see, sorry, I'm all embarrassed, okay. So, yeah, Cathy is married now to Linton Heathcliff, and Nellie Dean is looking for Cathy, and she's locked away upstairs, and Nellie Dean sees Linton Heathcliff, and he's sort of just like hanging out, and now that he has pleased his father, he's no longer as afraid of Heathcliff as he had been. And Nellie's like, well, why aren't you helping her? Why aren't you, why are you just leaving her up there to suffer? It's like, she helped you. And it's like, well, Papa wants her back there. And it's like, I'm not going to go across my dad. And she's like, she crossed her dad for you. She came out and visited you. She did so much for you. She loved you. And this is how you repay her? And Linton starts to feel a little bit bad. But again, Linton Heathcliff is sort of emotionally stunted. He has only so much to give, and he is a rather selfish creature, as he's described himself even, and he just doesn't have enough empathy for his cousin to reach out and help her there. He describes to Nellie how, his father had been physically abusive even to Cathy, and that he hadn't stepped in. He didn't enjoy it, but he hadn't stepped in to stop it. And so we know now that Linton is not going to stand up for his cousin, now his wife as well, against the father. Nellie is sent home by Heathcliff eventually. She goes back. She tells Edgar Linton that, his daughter is okay, although married to Linton Heathcliff. She doesn't make it sound as bad as she could, though, because she doesn't want to distress Edgar, who she can tell is very near death. They're making plans to go back and sort of get Cathy back if they have to, but instead she says that she returns back to Thrushcross Grange on her own. She says that Linton did help her get the key and escape, and that she's now able to see her father. And Nellie advises her to just don't say too much about it. Again, don't distress her father in his last moments. And so he does die with his daughter nearby, and he's so happy. Meanwhile, though, in the time between when Cathy had returned and when Nellie had told Edgar what was going on, Edgar had said, I need to revise the will. I can't have everything going through her to her husband because I don't want Heathcliff to control everything. We need to have some money set aside for her so she's protected. He tries to rearrange his affairs. He tries to call his attorney. His attorney doesn't show up. What we find out at the end of that chapter is that Mr. Green, the attorney, had basically purposely not shown up to amend the will of Edgar Linton at the behest of Heathcliff, because Heathcliff did not want to be cut out of that will. So it's an ugly affair. But Edgar Linton dies peaceful, thinking his daughter is happily wed to her cousin, his own nephew, and that, maybe the nephew is more like he and his sister rather than like Heathcliff. And so Chapter 29, after the funeral of Edgar Linton, he is buried next to his wife, Cathy Earnshaw Linton. These names. In the next chapter, let's see, they had hoped that Cathy would be allowed to stay at Thrushcross Grange, or perhaps even bring Linton to live with her. But Heathcliff comes by and he says, oh, no, no, no. I own this area, this land now. All the servants are fired except for you, Nellie Dean. You're going to stay and watch over the place. And she's like, really? Why can't I go back to to Wuthering Heights? Sorry, I saw it reconnecting. Everyone is fired except for Nellie Dean. And Nellie Dean even asked, like, I don't really want to stay at Thrushcross Grange. I would rather go with my mistress, with, you know, young Cathy. Can I please go with you to Wuthering Heights? And he says, no, 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 you need to stay here. I'm planning on getting a tenant. And again, we know from our reading that that tenant will become Mr. Lockwood. And, so Mrs. Dean would like to return, but she cannot. And Heathcliff, in an odd mood, starts telling things to Nellie that he opens up his heart in a way that you otherwise wouldn't expect. And basically what he says is that he still loves Cathy, the first Cathy, the mother, and that he tells a couple strange things about it. Like basically he says too, like as they were getting ready to bury Edgar, he managed to peek in there and to open Cathy's grave. And he saw that her face was still beautiful, that she had not decomposed basically in the 18 years or 17 years since her death. So first off, creepy. And what he had also done too is he arranged to have a little piece of wood from her coffin, like sort of removed. So as Cathy's buried in the middle, on one side is Edgar, and on the other side where the wood is removed, Heathcliff will be buried next to her eventually, and there'll be nothing between their corpses, so they'll be able to be closer to each other. This is what he wants. And he also says too how, let's see, he talks about too how the moment when Cathy had first died, when Cathy died and she was buried, he had actually gone that evening and gone by her grave, and he had tried to dig up her grave, and just on the verge of like opening up her casket, basically, he had felt her presence. And he had felt her presence, and he had known he didn't need to open it. And he said that since then, it's felt like torture, that he can see her and feel her almost nearby, but he can't see her. And that since that time, it's like her presence has been with him almost constantly, that he sort of can feel her outside, so he'll go walking on the moors to be closer, and then she's not there, but he can tell she's at the house, so he'll return to the house, but she's not quite there. And it's just like she's always just out of reach, but nearby. And so he says in that sense, like he tried to sleep in her room even, but he couldn't because he kept feeling her presence nearby, and he'd open his eyes. And so constantly, he both sees her and feels her, and yet she's just out of reach. And so this moment of being able to open her grave or open her casket when upon the burial of Edgar Linton was a relief to him, that he could see her face finally once more after all these years. So again, very, very weird that he was digging into her grave to see her. Let's see, and then chapter 3, that pretty much ended that chapter. He takes young Cathy with him back to Wuthering Heights, and she begs Ellen to visit her before she leaves. And Heathcliff tells Ellen, oh, no, 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 you absolutely cannot come over to the house. I will speak to you here when I want to see you. You may not come visit. So again, he's trying to torture and to hurt young Cathy. Let's see. In chapter 30, Nellie fills us in on some little bits that she's able to discover. She's able to talk to Zillah, the housekeeper at Wuthering Heights, who is not a close confidant of hers, and she learns that basically when young Cathy arrived to live at Wuthering Heights, she was a bit snippy with some of the staff, with Zillah, and so she and Joseph were snippy in return to her. They were not sympathetic to her. Also that Cathy had asked for help with nursing her husband, Linton Heathcliff, who was dying, and everyone else in the household was like, we don't care if he's dying, he's your responsibility, he's your husband, you take care of him. So basically Cathy is left alone to nurse her dying husband until finally Linton Heathcliff does indeed die. And she's alone and she's sad, and the rest of the household at that point, Hareton and Zillah, they try to give her a little comfort, and she's just like, no, you weren't there for me when I needed you, when I was lonely, when I was hurting, when I needed help. You don't get to be friendly to me now. And so she's, cold to them. Hareton again tries to be a little friendly, like he asks Zillah to ask her to read to them. Hareton even says that he did offer to help more than once. He asked Mr. Heathcliff to let me wake for you, but Mr. Heathcliff had told Hareton to stay out of it. And so Hareton is, sad to hear that this is how she sees them. And then it says, she ends her story with basically saying, she would like to move away if she could, to take Cathy with her, for the two of them to set up house, but she knows that Mr. Heathcliff would not allow it, and so she cannot do it. Finally, it ends with Mr. Lockwood saying that, now that he's getting better, now that he's recovering from his own illness, he proposes getting on horseback in a day or two, riding over to Wuthering Heights to inform my landlord that I shall spend the next 6 months in London, and if he likes, he may look out for another tenant to take the place after October, as he would not like to spend another winter there. So he's going to continue to rent the house at Thrushcross Grange, but he's planning on going to London for a while. So that's going to cause a little interruption in our story as we lose our erstwhile narrator, Mr. Lockwood. But there are still 4 chapters left in our book. We have a lot of resolution to do over these next few days. Let's go ahead and start with chapter 31, where today we're going to read 31 and 32 of Wuthering Heights. Let's go in for chapter 31. Yesterday was bright, calm, and frosty. I went to the Heights as I proposed. My housekeeper entreated me to bear a little note from her to her young lady, and I did not refuse, for the worthy woman was not conscious of anything odd in her request. The front door stood open, but the jealous gate was fastened, as at my last visit. I knocked and invoked Earnshaw from among the garden beds. He unchained it, and I entered. The fellow is as handsome a rustic as need be seen. I took particular notice of him this time, but then he does his best, apparently, to make the least of his advantages. I asked if Mr. Heathcliff were at home. He answered no, but he would be in at dinner time. It was 11 o'clock, and I announced my intention of going in and waiting for him, at which he immediately flung down his tools and accompanied me in the office of watchdog, not as a substitute for the host. We entered together. Catherine was there, making herself useful in preparing some vegetables for the approaching meal. She looked more sulky and less spirited than when I had seen her first. She hardly raised her eyes to notice me, and continued her employment with the same disregard to common forms of politeness as before, never returning my bow and good morning by the slightest acknowledgement. She does not seem so amiable, I thought, as Mrs. Dean would persuade me to believe. She's a beauty, it is true, but not an angel. Earnshaw surlily bid her remove her things to the kitchen. "Remove them yourself," she said, pushing them from her as soon as she had done, and retiring to a stool by the window, where she began to carve figures of birds and beasts out of the turnip parings in her lap. I approached her, pretending to desire a view of the garden, and, as I fancied, adroitly dropped Mrs. Dean's note onto her knee, unnoticed by Hareton, but she asked aloud, "What is that?" and chucked it off. "A letter from your old acquaintance, the housekeeper at the Grange," I answered, annoyed at her exposing my kind deed, and fearful lest it should be imagined a missive of my own. She would gladly have seized it up at this information, but Hareton beat her. He seized and put it in his waistcoat, saying Mr. Heathcliff should look at it first. Thereat, Catherine silently turned her face from us, and very stealthily drew out her pocket handkerchief and applied it to her eyes. And her cousin, after struggling a while to keep down his softer feelings, pulled out the letter and flung it on the floor beside her, as ungraciously as he could. Catherine caught and perused it eagerly. Then she put a few questions to me concerning the inmates, rational and irrational, of her former home, and gazing toward the hills, murmured in soliloquy, "I should like to be riding Minnie down there. I should like to be climbing up there. Oh, I'm tired. I'm stalled, Hareton." And she leant her pretty head back against the sill, with half a yawn and half a sigh, and lapsed into an aspect of abstracted sadness, neither caring nor knowing whether we remarked her. "Mrs. Heathcliff," I said, after sitting some time mute, "are you not aware that I am an acquaintance of yours? So intimate that I think it strange you won't come and speak to me. My housekeeper never wearies of talking about you and praising you, and she'll be greatly disappointed if I return with no news of, or from you, except that you received her letter and said nothing." She appeared to wonder at this speech and asked, Does Ellen like you? Yes, very well, I replied unhesitatingly. You must tell her, she continued, that I would answer her letter, but I have no materials for writing, not even a book from which I might tear a leaf. No books, I exclaimed. How do you contrive to live here without them? If I may take the liberty to inquire. Though provided with a large library, I'm frequently very dull at the Grange. Take my books away, and I should be desperate. Oh. I was always reading when I had them, said Catherine, and Mr. Heathcliff never reads, so he took it into his head to destroy my books. I have not had a glimpse of one for weeks. Only once I searched through Joseph's stores of theology to his great irritation. And once, Hareton, I came upon a secret stock in your room, some Latin and Greek and some tales and poetry, all old friends. I brought the last year, and you gathered them, as a magpie gathers silver spoons, for the mere love of stealing. They are of no use to you, or else you concealed them in the bad spirit, that, as you cannot enjoy them, nobody else shall. Perhaps your envy counseled Mr. Heathcliff to rob me of my treasures, but I've most of them written on my brain and printed in my heart, and you cannot deprive me of those. Earnshaw blushed crimson when his cousin made this revelation of his private literary accumulations, and stammered an indignant denial of her accusations. Mr. Hareton is desirous of increasing his amount of knowledge, I said, coming to his rescue. He is not envious, but emulous of your attainments. He'll be a clever scholar in a few years. And he wants me to sink into a dunce meantime, answered Catherine. Yes, I hear him trying to spell and read to himself, and pretty blunders he makes. I wish you would repeat Chevy Chase as you did yesterday. It was extremely funny. I heard you. And I heard you turning over the dictionary to seek out the hard words, and then cursing because you couldn't read their explanations. The young man evidently thought it too bad that he should be laughed at for his ignorance, and then laughed at for trying to remove it. I had a similar notion, and, remembering Mrs. Dean's anecdote of his first attempt at enlightening the darkness in which he had been reared, I observed, But Mrs. Heathcliff, we have each had a commencement, and each stumbled and tottered on the threshold, and had our teachers scorned, instead of aiding us, we should stumble and totter yet. Oh, she replied, I don't wish to limit his acquirements. Still, he has no right to appropriate what is mine, and make it ridiculous to me with his vile mistakes and mispronunciations. Those books, both prose and verse, were consecrated to me by other associations, and I hate to have them debased and profaned in his mouth. Besides, of all, he has selected my favorite pieces that I love the most to repeat, as if out of deliberate malice. Hareton's chest heaved in silence a minute. He labored under a severe sense of mortification and wrath, which it was no easy task to suppress. I rose and, from a gentlemanly idea of relieving his embarrassment, took up my station in the doorway, surveying the external prospect as I stood. He followed my example and left the room, but presently reappeared, bearing 6 volumes in his hands, which he threw into Catherine's lap, exclaiming, Take them! I never want to hear or read or think of them again. I won't have them now, she answered. I shall connect them with you and hate them. She opened one that had obviously been often turned over and read a portion in the drawling tone of a beginner, then laughed and threw it from her. And listen, she continued provokingly, commencing a verse of an old ballad in the same fashion. But his self-love would endure no further torment. I heard, and not altogether disapprovingly, a manual check given to her saucy tongue. The little wretch had done her utmost to hurt her cousin's sensitive, though uncultivated feelings, and a physical argument was the only mode he had of balancing the account and repaying its effects on the inflictor. He afterwards gathered the books and hurled them on the fire. I read in his countenance what anguish it was to offer that sacrifice to spleen. I fancied that as they consumed, he recalled the pleasure they had already imparted, and the triumph and ever-increasing pleasure he had anticipated from them. And I guessed the incitement to his secret studies also. He had been content with daily labor and rough animal enjoyments. till Catherine crossed his path. Shame at her scorn and hope of her approval were his first prompters to higher pursuits, and instead of guarding him from one and winning him the other, his endeavors to raise himself had produced just the contrary result. "Yes, that's all the good that such a brute as you can get from them," cried Catherine, sucking her damaged lip and watching the conflagration with indignant eyes. "You'd better hold your tongue now," he answered fiercely, and his agitation precluding further speech, he advanced hastily to the entrance, where I made way for him to pass. But ere he had crossed the door-stones, Mr. Heathcliff, coming up the causeway, encountered him, and laying hold of his shoulder, asked, "What's to do now, my lad?" Not, he said, and broke away, to enjoy his grief and anger in solitude. Heathcliff gazed after him and sighed. "It will be odd if I thwart myself," he muttered, unconscious that I was behind him. "But when I look for his father in his face, I see her every day more. How the devil is he so like? I can hardly bear to see him." He bent his eyes to the ground and walked moodily in. There was a restless, anxious expression in his countenance I had never remarked there before, and he looked sparer in person. His daughter-in-law, on perceiving him through the window, immediately escaped to the kitchen, so that I remained alone. "I'm glad to see you out of doors again, Mr. Lockwood," he said in reply to my greeting. "From selfish motives partly. I don't think I could readily supply your loss in this desolation. I've wondered more than once what brought you here." "An idle whim, I fear, sir," was my answer, "or else an idle whim is going to spirit me away. I shall set out for London next week, and I must give you warning that I feel no disposition to retain Thrushcross Grange beyond the 12 months I agreed to rent it. I believe I shall not live there any more." "Oh, indeed. You're tired of being banished from the world, are you?" he said. "But if you are coming to plead off paying for a place you won't occupy, your journey is useless. I never relent in exacting my due from anyone." "I'm coming to plead off nothing about it," I exclaimed, considerably irritated. "Should you wish it, I'll settle with you now," and I drew my notebook from my pocket. No, he replied coolly. "You'll leave sufficient behind to cover your debts if you fail to return. I'm not in such a hurry. Sit down and take your dinner with us. A guest that is safe from repeating his visit can generally be made welcome. Catherine, bring the things in. Where are you?" Catherine reappeared, bearing a tray of knives and forks. "You may get your dinner with Joseph," muttered Heathcliff aside, "and remain in the kitchen till he is gone." She obeyed his directions very punctually. Perhaps she had no temptation to transgress. Living among clowns and misanthropists, she probably cannot appreciate a better class of people when she meets them. With Mr. Heathcliff, grim and saturnine on one hand, and Hareton, absolutely dumb, on the other, I made a somewhat cheerless meal and bid adieu early. I would have departed by the back way to get a last glimpse of Catherine and annoy old Joseph, but Hareton received orders to lead up my horse, and my host himself escorted me to the door, so I could not fulfill my wish. How dreary life gets over in that house, I reflected, while riding down the road. What a realization of something more romantic than a fairy tale it would have been for Mrs. Linton Heathcliff had she and I struck up an attachment, as her good nurse desired, and migrated together into the stirring atmosphere of the town. And now chapter 32. 1802. This September I was invited to devastate the moors of a friend in the north, and on my journey to his abode I unexpectedly came within 15 miles of Gimmerton. The hostler at a roadside public house was holding a pail of water to refresh my horses when a cart of very green oats, newly reaped, passed by, and he remarked, "Yon's Frau Gimmerton now. They're all's 3 wick after other folk with their harvest." Gimmerton, I repeated. My residence in that locality had already grown dim and dreary. "Ah, I know. How far is it from this?" "Happen 14 mile o'er the hills and a rough road," he answered. A sudden impulse seized me to visit Thrushcross Grange. It was scarcely noon, and I conceived that I might as well pass the night under my own roof as in an inn. Besides, I could spare a day easily to arrange matters with my landlord, and thus save myself the trouble of invading the neighborhood again. Having rested a while, I directed my servant to inquire the way to the village, and with great fatigue to our beasts, we managed the distance in some 3 hours. I left him there and proceeded down the valley alone. The grey church looked greyer, and the lonely churchyard lonelier. I distinguished a moor sheep cropping the short turf on the graves. It was sweet, warm weather, too warm for traveling, but the heat did not hinder me from enjoying the delightful scenery above and below. Had I seen it nearer August, I'm sure it would have tempted me to waste a month among its solitudes. In winter, nothing more dreary. In summer, nothing more divine than those glens shut in by hills and those bluff, bold swells of heath. I reached the Grange before sunset and knocked for admittance, but the family had retreated into the back premises. I judged by one thin blue wreath curling from the kitchen chimney, and they did not hear. I rode into the court. Under the porch, a girl of 9 or 10 sat knitting, and an old woman reclined on the horse steps, smoking a meditative pipe. "Is Mrs. Dean within?" I demanded of the dame. "Mistress Dean? Nay," she answered. "Shoo doesn't bide here. Shoo's up at the Heights." "Are you the housekeeper, then?" I continued. "Yeah, I'll keep the house," she replied. "Well, I'm Mr. Lockwood, the master. Are there any rooms to lodge me in, I wonder? I wish to stay here all night." "To Meister!" she cried in astonishment. "Wet! Whoever knew ya were comin'? Ya should ha' send word. They's not norther dry, nor men's full about to place. Nowt there 'tisn't. Nowt there is not." There you go. She threw down her pipe and bustled in. The girl followed, and I entered too. Soon perceiving that her report was true, and moreover, that I had almost upset her wits by my unwelcome apparition, I bid her be composed. I would go out for a walk, and meantime she must try to prepare a corner of a sitting room for me to sup in, and a bedroom to sleep in. No sweeping and dusting, only good fires and dry sheets were necessary. She seemed willing to do her best, though she thrust the hearth-brush into the grates in mistake for the poker, and mal-appropriated several other pieces of her craft. But I retired, confiding in her energy for a resting place against my return. Wuthering Heights was the goal of my proposed excursion, and afterthought brought me back when I had quitted the court. "All well at the Heights?" I inquired of the woman. "Yeah, for aught I know," she answered, scurrying away with a pan of hot cinders. I would have asked why Mrs. Dean had deserted the Grange, but it was impossible to delay her at such a crisis, so I turned away and made my exit, rambling leisurely along, with the glow of a sinking sun behind and the mild glory of a rising moon in front, one fading and the other brightening as I quitted the park and climbed the stony byroad branching off to Mr. Heathcliff's dwelling. Before I arrived in sight of it, all that remained of day was a beamless amber light along the west, but I could see every pebble on the path and every blade of grass by that splendid moon. I had neither to climb the gate nor to knock. It yielded to my hand. That is an improvement, I thought, and I noticed another by the aid of my nostrils, a fragrance of stalks and wallflowers wafted on the air from amongst the homely fruit trees. Both doors and lattices were open, and yet, as is usually the case in a coal district, a fine red fire illumined the chimney. The comfort which the eye derives from it renders the extra heat endurable. But the house of Wuthering Heights is so large that the inmates have plenty of space for withdrawing out of its influence, and accordingly, what inmates there were had stationed themselves not far from one of the windows. I could both see them and hear them talk before I entered, and looked and listened in consequence, being moved thereto by a mingled sense of curiosity and envy that grew as I lingered. "Contrary," said a voice as sweet as a silver bell. "That for the 3rd time, you dunce! I'm not going to tell you again. Recollect, or I pull your hair." "Contrary, then," answered another, in deep but softened tones. "And now, kiss me for minding so well." "No, read it over first correctly, without a single mistake." The male speaker began to read. He was a young man, respectably dressed and seated at a table, having a book before him. His handsome features glowed with pleasure, and his eyes kept impatiently wandering from the page to a small white hand over his shoulder, which recalled him by a smart slap on the cheek whenever its owner detected some signs of inattention. Its owner stood behind, her light, shining ringlets blending at intervals with his brown locks as she bent to superintend his studies. And her face, it was lucky he could not see her face, or he would never have been so steady. I could, and I bit my lip, in spite at having thrown away the chance I might have had of doing something besides staring at its smiting beauty. The task was done, not free from further blunders, but the pupil claimed a reward and received at least 5 kisses, which, however, he generously returned. Then they came to the door, and from their conversation, I judged that they were about to issue out and have a walk on the moors. I supposed I should be condemned in Hareton Earnshaw's heart, if not by his mouth, to the lowest pit in the infernal regions if I showed my unfortunate person in his neighborhood then, and feeling very mean and malignant, I skulked round to seek refuge in the kitchen. There was unobstructed admittance on that side also, and at the door sat my old friend, Nellie Dean, sewing and singing a song, which was often interrupted from within by harsh words of scorn and intolerance uttered in far from musical accents. "I'd rather, by the half, have him swearing in my lugs from morn to night, nor hearken high silver, said the tenant of the kitchen, in answer to an unheard speech of Nellie's. "It's a blaring shame, but I cannot open to blessed book, but ye set up them glories to Satan, and all to flaysome wickednesses at ever were born into the world. Oh, you're a right nout, and choose another, and that poor lad'll be lost atween ye. Poor lad," he added with a groan. "He's witched, I'm sartin on it. Oh Lord, judge 'em, for they's norther law nor justice among we're rullers." "No, or we should be sitting in flaming faggots, I suppose," retorted the singer. "But wisht, old man, and read your Bible like a Christian, and never mind me. This is Fairy Annie's Wedding, a bonny tune. It goes to a dance." Mrs. Dean was about to recommence when I advanced, and recognizing me directly, she jumped to her feet, crying, "Why, bless you, Mr. Lockwood! How could you think of returning in this way? All shut up at Thrushcross Grange. You should have given us notice." "I've arranged to be accommodated there for as long as I shall stay," I answered. "I depart again tomorrow. And how are you transplanted here, Mrs. Dean? Tell me that." "Zillah left, and Mr. Heathcliff wished me to come soon after you went to London, and stay till you returned. But step in, pray. Have you walked from Gimmerton this evening?" "From the Grange," I replied, "and while they make me lodging room there, I want to finish my business with your master, because I don't think of having another opportunity in a hurry." "What business, sir?" said Nellie, conducting me into the house. "He's gone out at present, and won't return soon." "About the rent," I answered. "Oh, then it is with Mrs. Heathcliff you must settle," she observed, "or rather with me. She has not learnt to manage her affairs yet, and I act for her. There's nobody else." I looked surprised. "Ah, you have not heard of Heathcliff's death, I see," she continued. "Heathcliff dead?" I exclaimed, astonished. "How long ago?" 3 months since. But sit down and let me take your hat, and I'll tell you all about it. Stop, you have had nothing to eat, have you?" "I want nothing. I have ordered supper at home. You sit down too. I never dreamt of his dying. Let me hear how it came to pass. You say you don't expect them back for some time, the young people?" "No, I have to scold them every evening for their late rambles, but they don't care for me. At least, have a drink of our old ale. It will do you good. You seem weary." She hastened to fetch it before I could refuse, and I heard Joseph asking whether it warn't a crying scandal that she should have fellies at her time of life, and then to get them jocks out to Meister's cellar. He fair shamed to bide still and see it. She did not stay to retaliate, but re-entered in a minute, bearing a reaming silver pint, whose contents I lauded with becoming earnestness. And afterwards she furnished me with the sequel of Heathcliff's history. He had a queer end, as she expressed it. "I was summoned to Wuthering Heights within a fortnight of your leaving us," she said, and I obeyed joyfully for Catherine's sake. My first interview with her grieved and shocked me. She had altered so much since our separation. Mr. Heathcliff did not explain his reasons for taking a new mind about my coming here. He only told me he wanted me, and he was tired of seeing Catherine. I must make the little parlor my sitting room and keep her with me. It was enough if he were obliged to see her once or twice a day. She seemed pleased at this arrangement, and by degrees I smuggled over a great number of books and other articles that had formed her amusement at the Grange, and flattered myself that we should get on in tolerable comfort. The delusion did not last long. Catherine, contented at first, in a brief space grew irritable and restless. For one thing, she was forbidden to move out of the garden, and it fretted her sadly to be confined to its narrow bounds as spring drew on. For another, in following the house, I was forced to quit her frequently, and she complained of loneliness. She preferred quarreling with Joseph in the kitchen to sitting at peace in her solitude. I did not mind their skirmishes, but Hareton was often obliged to seek the kitchen also, when the master wanted to have the house to himself. And though in the beginning she either left it at his approach, or quietly joined in my occupation, and shunned remarking or addressing him, and though he was always as sullen and silent as possible, after a while she changed her behavior, and became incapable of letting him alone, talking at him, commenting on his stupidity and idleness, expressing her wonder how he could endure the life he lived, how he could sit a whole evening staring into the fire and dozing. "He's just like a dog, is he not, Ellen?" she once observed, "or a cart horse? He does his work, eats his food, and sleeps eternally. What a blank, dreary mind he must have. Do you ever dream, Hareton? And if you do, what is it about? But you can't speak to me." Then she looked at him, but he would neither open his mouth nor look again. "He's perhaps dreaming now," she continued. He twitched his shoulder as Juno twitches hers. "Ask him, Ellen." "Mr. Hareton will ask the master to send you upstairs if you don't behave," I said. He had not only twitched his shoulder, but clenched his fist, as if tempted to use it. "I know why Hareton never speaks when I am in the kitchen," she exclaimed on another occasion. "He is afraid I shall laugh at him. Ellen, what do you think? He began to teach himself to read once, and because I laughed, he burned his books and dropped it. Was he not a fool?" "Were not you naughty?" I said. "Answer me that." "Perhaps I was," she went on, "but I did not expect him to be so silly. Hareton, if I gave you a book, would you take it now?" "I'll try." She placed one she had been perusing on his hand. He flung it off and muttered if she did not give over, he would break her neck. "Well, I shall put it here," she said, "in the table drawer, and I'm going to bed." Then she whispered me to watch whether he touched it, and departed. But he would not come near it, and so I informed her in the morning, to her great disappointment. I saw she was sorry for his persevering sulkiness and indolence. Her conscience reproved her for frightening him off improving himself. She had done it effectually. But her ingenuity was at work to remedy the injury. While I ironed or pursued other stationary employments I could not well do in the parlor, she would bring some pleasant volume and read it aloud to me. When Hareton was there, she generally paused in an interesting part and left the book lying about. That she did repeatedly, but he was as obstinate as a mule, and instead of snatching at her bait, in wet weather he took to smoking with Joseph, and they sat like automatons, one on each side of the fire, the elder happily too deaf to understand her wicked nonsense, as he would have called it, the younger doing his best to seem to disregard it. On fine evenings the latter followed his shooting expeditions, and Catherine yawned and sighed and teased me to talk to her, and ran off into the court or garden the moment I began, and as a last resource cried and said she was tired of living. Her life was useless. Mr. Heathcliff, who grew more and more disinclined to society, had almost banished Earnshaw out of his apartment. Owing to an accident at the commencement of March, he became for some days a fixture in the kitchen. His gun burst while out on the hills by himself. A splinter cut his arm, and he lost a good deal of blood before he could reach home. The consequence was that, perforce, he was condemned to the fireside in tranquility till he made it up again. It suited Catherine to have him there. At any rate, it made her hate her room upstairs more than ever, and she would compel me to find out business below, that she might accompany me. On Easter Monday, Joseph went to Gimmerton Fair with some cattle, and in the afternoon I was busy getting up linen in the kitchen. Earnshaw sat, morose as usual, at the chimney corner, and my little mistress was beguiling an idle hour with drawing pictures on the window panes, varying her amusement by smothered bursts of songs and whispered ejaculations and quick glances of annoyance and impatience in the direction of her cousin, who steadfastly smoked and looked into the grate. At a notice that I could do with her no longer, intercepting my light, she removed to the hearthstone. I bestowed little attention of her proceedings, but presently I heard her begin, "I've found out, Hareton, that I'm glad, that I should like you to be my cousin now, if you had not grown so cross to me, and so rough." Hareton returned no answer. "Hareton, do you hear?" she continued. "Get off wi' ye," he growled with uncompromising gruffness. "Let me take that pipe," she said, cautiously advancing her hand and abstracting it from his mouth. Before he could attempt to recover it, it was broken and behind the fire. He swore at her and seized another. "Stop," she cried. "You must listen to me first, and I can't speak while those clouds are floating in my face." "Will you go to the devil," he exclaimed ferociously, "and let me be?" "No," she persisted, "I won't. I can't tell what to do to make you talk to me, and you are determined not to understand. When I call you stupid, I don't mean anything. I don't mean that I despise you. Come, you shall take notice of me, Hareton. You are my cousin, and you shall own me." "I shall have naught to do with you and your mucky pride and your damned mocking tricks," he answered. "I'll go to hell, body and soul, before I look sideways after you again. Side out at the gate now, this minute." Catherine frowned and retreated to the window seat, chewing her lip and endeavoring, by humming an eccentric tune, to conceal a growing tendency to sob. "You should be friends with your cousin, Mr. Hareton," I interrupted, "since she repents of her sauciness. It would do you a great deal of good. It would make you another man to have her for a companion." "A companion," he cried, "when she hates me and does not think me fit to wipe her shoon. Nay, if it made me a king, I'd not be scorned for seeking her goodwill any more." "It is not I who hate you. It is you who hate me," wept Cathy, no longer disguising her trouble. "You hate me as much as Mr. Heathcliff does, and more." "You're a damned liar," began Earnshaw. "Why have I made him angry by taking your part then 100 times? And that when you sneered at and despised me, and go on plaguing me, and I'll step in yonder and say you worried me out of the kitchen." "I didn't know you took my part," she answered, drying her eyes, "and I was miserable and bitter at everybody. But now I thank you and beg you to forgive me. What can I do besides?" She returned to the hearth and frankly extended her hand. He blackened and scowled like a thundercloud and kept his fists resolutely clenched and his gaze fixed on the ground. Catherine, by instinct, must have divined it was obdurate perversity and not dislike that prompted this dogged conduct, for after remaining an instant undecided, she stooped and impressed on his cheek a gentle kiss. The little rogue thought I had not seen her, and drawing back, she took her former station by the window, quite demurely. I shook my head reprovingly, and then she blushed and whispered, "Well, what should I have done, Ellen? He wouldn't shake hands, and he wouldn't look. I must show him some way that I like him, that I want to be friends." Whether the kiss convinced Hareton, I cannot tell. He was very careful for some minutes that his face should not be seen, and when he did raise it, he was sadly puzzled where to turn his eyes. Catherine employed herself in wrapping a handsome book neatly in white paper, and having tied it with a bit of ribbon and addressing it to Mr. Hareton Earnshaw, she desired me to be her ambassadress and convey the present to its destined recipient. "And tell him, if he'll take it, I'll come and teach him to read it right," she said. "And if he refuse it, I'll go upstairs and never tease him again." I carried it and repeated the message, anxiously watched by my employer. Hareton would not open his fingers, so I laid it on his knee. He did not strike it off either. I returned to my work. Catherine leaned her head and arms on the table till she heard the slight rustle of the covering being removed. Then she stole away and quietly seated herself beside her cousin. He trembled and his face glowed. All his rudeness and all his surly harshness had deserted him. He could not summon courage at first to utter a syllable in reply to her questioning look and her murmured petition. Say you forgive me, Hareton. Do. You can make me so happy by speaking that little word. He muttered something inaudible. And you'll be my friend? Added Catherine interrogatively. Nay, you'll be ashamed of me every day of your life, he answered, and the more you know me, and I cannot bide it. So you won't be my friend, she said, smiling as sweet as honey and creeping close up. I overheard no further distinguishable talk, but on looking round again, I perceived two such radiant countenances bent over the page of the accepted book that I did not doubt the treaty had been ratified on both sides, and the enemies were thenceforth sworn allies. The work they studied was full of costly pictures, and those and their position had charm enough to keep them unmoved till Joseph came home. He, poor man, was perfectly aghast at the spectacle of Catherine seated on the same bench with Hareton Earnshaw, leaning her hand on his shoulder, and confounded at his favourite's endurance of her proximity. It affected him too deeply to allow an observation on the subject that night. His emotion was only revealed by the immense sighs he drew as he solemnly spread his large Bible on the table and overlaid it with dirty banknotes from his pocketbook, the produce of the day's transactions. At length he summoned Hareton from his seat. "Tak these into to Meister, lad," he said. "Unbide there. I's going up to my own room. This hole's neither mensful nor seemly for us. We mun side out and search another." "Come, Catherine," I said. "We must side out too. I've done my ironing. Are you ready to go?" "It is not 8 o'clock," she answered, rising unwillingly. "Hareton, I'll leave this book upon the chimney-piece, and I'll bring some more tomorrow." "Ony books that you leave, I shall take into the house," said Joseph. "And it'll be mitch if you find 'em again. So you may please yourself." Cathy threatened that his library should pay for hers, and, smiling as she passed Hareton, went singing upstairs. Lighter of heart, I venture to say, than ever she had been under that roof before, except, perhaps, during her earliest visits to Linton. The intimacy thus commenced grew rapidly, though it encountered temporary interruptions. Earnshaw was not to be civilized with the wish, and my young lady was no philosopher and no paragon of patience. But their both minds tending to the same place, one loving and desiring to esteem, and the other loving and desiring to be esteemed, they contrived in the end to reach it. You see, Mr. Lockwood, it was easy enough to win Mrs. Heathcliff's heart. But now I'm glad you did not try. The crown of all my wishes will be the union of those two. I shall envy no one on their wedding day. There won't be a happier woman than myself in England. That concludes today's reading from Wuthering Heights. We now know the fate of Mrs. Cathy Linton Heathcliff, that she is about to be Mrs. Cathy Linton Heathcliff Earnshaw. All the names united. But we do not yet know how Mr. Heathcliff died, and so that is what we will find out tomorrow in our concluding 2 chapters of Wuthering Heights. Thank you again for joining me for today's reading. If you have not yet voted on what to read next, please go ahead and vote in that poll. And as mentioned, I will post the links to both register to watch the film on Wednesday, the 1970 adaptation of Wuthering Heights. And also, if you'd like to attend our tea party on Thursday to discuss Wuthering Heights, both the book and film, I'll go ahead and post that link today too. So thank you very much. Hope you have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your day. And tomorrow, finally, we will get the conclusion of Wuthering Heights. Take care, friends. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.